When I started doing this job 5 years ago, the first car I ever reviewed was the PROTON Iriz. It was newly launched. I got a 1.6 premium automatic, and I remember thinking, this is a good car, but there are a few things that let it down, which is why ultimately it wasn't the Myvi-killer that it was touted to be. Today, however, we've come full circle. This is the PROTON Iriz 1.6 Active. It's still got the same CVT, it's still got the same VVT engine, but PROTON promises that enough small changes have been made to make this car finally feel as coherent as it was supposed to be. On top of that, obviously, we have this new Active variant, which is brand new for the Iriz as of this year and this new facelift. So we're going to find out if finally, PROTON can fulfill its promises. Now with the Iriz Active, there are a few bits and bobs around the place to make the car look a little bit more like a crossover. But as for this facelift, we now get new headlights and a new grille design that's standard across the range. But for the Active, they are now dark tinted with LED illumination. We also now get new LED daytime running lights, which are of a slightly different design from before. And again, for the Active, we get this contrasting panel down here to make it look a little bit more active. Now down the side, the Active kind of emphasizes itself a little bit with these large swathes of black body cladding, again to make it look a bit more like a crossover. The tires are 16-inch units, but they now have a new design, which I must admit look rather fetching, and they're wrapped in Goodyear Assurance Triple Max 2 tires. Going down the side, you now get a set of fake roof rails. I mean, they're just there for aesthetic purposes. Don't try to fit a roof box on this. You still get the black roof as per the last facelift Iriz, and you also get a little bit of contrasting down at the bottom of the side skirt. Maybe there's another word for it, given that this is the Active model. Now at the back, you get a black spoiler, again to match the roof. The body cladding continues down toward the rear. You now get Active scripting here. You get the PROTON script that goes all the way across, no Thundercats logo, and you also don't get any visible exhaust pipes. Now, it's worth noting that this is a new color for the facelifted Iriz, which I'm not sure what they call it sort of corporately, but we're going to call this MalaysianMotoring orange because it's nice. Now at the back, of course, you also get the new Iriz badge with the R emphasized for reasons I don't quite understand, but most importantly, because this is a hatch, you get a decently sized boot. Now, obviously, this is smaller than what you get in the Perodua Myvi, but it is quite deep, which means you can actually put luggage back here relatively easily. You also get an electric tailgate release, which admittedly doesn't sound like the highest quality item in the world, but you know, I'll forgive it for that. The rear seats do fold 60-40, but they don't fold flat, so there's a little bit of a ridge for you to get things over. But once you do fold that flat, you do have a decent amount of space back here. Now, the refinements to this PROTON Iriz extend to the interior, which we will get to now. So this interior has received a rather extensive facelift. So for starters, the dashboard, the central console at least, has been significantly redesigned. The air vents are no longer by the sides, they now sit on the bottom of this freestanding central touchscreen. You also get digital aircon controls for the first time. They are still air conditioned, it's not climate control. You now get 3 USB ports down here. They're full-size USBs, not USB-Cs, and there's actually a little slot here, which is big enough to fit most flagship smartphones. You also get a lot of this contrasting color, so you get red here and red on the dials, and even red around the aircon vents, which admittedly look quite good. The faux stitching on the plastic dashboard continues, but the upholstery for the seats have been updated as well. So now these are semi-leather seats where you have fabric in the middle with this weird pattern on it and the leather out around the sides. You also get contrasting stitching done in red, and you get Active script on the backrest as well. You also would have spotted the Active stitched into the side of the doors, and you actually get that on all 4 doors, even though the Active script does not extend to the rear seats. You also get red seat belts like an AMG. Now, there's a lot more to talk about here. So for starters, you get, like I was saying earlier, you get this new freestanding display. This is a new GKUI system, replete with voice commands. So you can tell it to adjust the temperature. You can also get it to open the driver's side window. And it is always one of those always connected type things. So it has its own SIM card, and then you can play your Jukes music or wherever else through this with its own data plan. You also get this instrument cluster, which has been updated, like I said earlier, with the red rings, where you also get a full color multi-info display in the middle, which displays all sorts of stuff in it. Now, the trouble with that thing is it looks good, but the functionality is a little bit weird. So the info sort of thing and the trip reset is all on the side, and then you get these two stalks down here which control the vehicle settings. So to scroll, you press one side, and then to select, you press the other side, and it's just not very intuitive. I feel like they could have mounted the buttons to control that somewhere on the steering wheel. The steering wheel, though, also has been updated, so you have a little bit more of that contrast stuff here. It's perforated and leather wrapped with contrast stitching with the new Proton Thundercats logo in the middle. Now, admittedly, I quite liked the Iriz when it first came out. I was aware of its pitfall, but I still liked it nonetheless. And I feel like this update has made this car feel a lot more coherent. And I do quite like staring at a Proton badge in front of me, unlike certain people who insist on going around in Toyotas. Now, in the back, the Iriz again falls a little bit short of the segment best. Because this car is a little bit older, the wheelbase is a little bit shorter, and so legroom at the back is not quite that good. But that said, because these seats are mounted quite high, you can tuck your feet in underneath the front seats, and admittedly the rear seat squabs are quite long, so they do give you pretty decent lower thigh support. There are also two USB ports back there, but no aircon vents. But, you know, for what it's worth, it's not that bad. I wouldn't suggest putting 3 people in the back, 2 at most 3 in a pinch. And I reckon that you could probably take this car out for a longer distance without too much issue. But anyway, talking about long distance driving or driving in general, we better cut to that segment because there's a lot more that we need to talk about in here. Now, driving the Proton Iriz is quite an experience. The first car I ever reviewed was indeed a Proton Iriz 1.6 Premium at that, with the CVT automatic, and I remember thinking that it was such a fantastic car to drive, but I was really let down by the transmission, the CVT automatic by Punch Powertrains, which is still featured in this car. Now, the amazing thing was, within about 500 meters of driving away from Proton with this car in my care, I realized that there have been some significant changes made to this powertrain. So under the hood is the same 1.6 litre VVT engine from Proton, and in the middle is still the same clutched Punch CVT powertrain. But they've done a lot. Now, I must admit that I haven't driven an Iriz since that first Iriz. Proton has not been able to give me a test car up until now, so I can't really speak of the many evolutionary changes that have occurred from then till now. But looking at where it started and where it's ended up, this Iriz is a much more accomplished vehicle. For starters, the CVT powertrain is no longer, the CVT gearbox is no longer absolutely recalcitrant. It is actually quite responsive, not quite as responsive as a torque converter automatic like you get in a Proto Myvi, for example, but it's certainly more reactive than it used to be. So that means that when you're driving on the motorway, and even when you're going through some twisty bits or back roads, you will usually get the power that you demand from the throttle at roughly the same time frame that you ask for it, as opposed to before, where whenever you hit the throttle, the throttle would then send a letter to the gearbox, and the gearbox would then read that letter at its own leisure and then realize what's being requested of it, and then as the letter arrives back to the throttle that it is all affirmative, only then would it actually kick into action. Now it actually works like a proper gearbox, and that's certainly a good thing. Now, this responsiveness is available both on the lower end of the rev range as well as on the upper end of the rev range, which means it doesn't matter if you're driving quickly or slowly, it is still relatively responsive. There is a little bit of hesitance, I admit, when you're driving in traffic, for example. Cut and thrust traffic, trying to change lanes quickly on the motorway and stuff like that. Not really this car's strong suit, I must admit. But you can forgive that somewhat, especially when you take into account the fact that this powertrain is now so much quieter than before. The Iriz and Persona with this gearbox and engine combo were both very well known for being incredibly loud, both on and off throttle. So the gearbox especially used to whine like nobody's business, but now there's almost none of that. You only hear it when you have the throttle wide open, when you're really pinning it. Only then will you hear a degree of complaint from the gearbox. But otherwise, this car is quite quiet, and the transformation in terms of refinement from this gearbox is absolutely brilliant. Now, In terms of the engine, well, it's just as punchy as it used to be, but you definitely feel like you're not losing as much power as you used to by going with the CVT automatic. It's certainly enough for town driving, and it's alright on the motorway provided that you're sticking to the national speed limit. Anything above that, the car kind of loses puff. But to that end, I did drive this Iriz up Genting for an appointment that I had up there, and I have to say that this car does drive pretty well. It's not quite as tidy a handler as it used to be. The suspension has been reworked slightly for a better primary ride, and you definitely get that as you're driving along, but it's definitely not as sharp as it used to be. But in terms of what you might lose in body control, it makes up for it in terms of mechanical grip. The tires fitted to this car are incredibly good, and as a result you feel like there is a lot of grip for you to exploit when you're taking it a little bit faster than you should. But when you're just cruising along, this gearbox, like I said earlier, is quite refined, and so you can sit at 110 and it's not so bad. In terms of wind and road noise, there is a bit of wind noise that you hear at speeds above 100 kilometers an hour, and there is a little bit of road roar, but it is honestly pretty good for the class. It's not going to blow you away, but it does all right. Now, in one area that this car doesn't do that impressively, unfortunately, is in terms of fuel economy. Now, again, the Iriz used to be a very, very heavy drinker, with fuel consumption rated at about 10 liters per 100 kilometers previously. But now, with all of the refinements made to the gearbox and the engine, and also the inclusion of eco mode, which I must admit we didn't use that much, these cars are doing better than they used to, but it's still not great. This Iriz, which I've driven almost 1,000 kilometers, and my co-presenter Shasha actually took this car up to Ipoh, and we've not seen a figure below about 8 liters per 100 kilometers. Now, you can get better than that out of a Proto Myvi, you can get better than that out of a lot of this car's B-segment hatchback competitors, so it isn't that great, particularly given the fact that this car isn't exactly the most powerful in class either, so it kind of dulls the experience a little bit. But that said, I feel like the Proton Iriz is designed for people who want to stand out, especially in this active variant. It certainly draws attention. Now, I had the Persona and Iriz with me together for a couple of days, and I admit that most of the time I would end up reaching for the key for the Proton Iriz. There's something about it that it has so much character to it, and it makes it a really fun thing to be in. These red seat belts, the red accents around the interior, and the semi-bucket seats with active script on it, I don't know, it does something for me. And when I drove it up Genting, up and down, and then on Kara and so on, I was reminded just how tidily these cars handle, and that is something that the competition still cannot touch. It doesn't matter which brand you're looking at, but these cars drive really, really well. And so I figure that the Iriz exists for a reason. This is for the sort of driver that really enjoys driving, and they're willing to make certain sacrifices in order to fulfill that desire to scratch that itch. But the sacrifices are not as big as they used to be. That's all I want to say. The Iriz used to be a conscious choice. It used to be choosing that driving experience over so many other considerations. But now the Iriz is a lot more accomplished and a lot more refined and it's a lot more cohesive and better put together. And as a result, I feel like this is a car that you can now buy without having to think about those compromises. Admittedly, there is one area that I wish these cars would improve, and that is in terms of active safety. The fact that these cars do not come with autonomous emergency braking or blind spot monitoring or anything of that matter is quite sedih lah. I think that if this car had the same sort of active safety as offered by Proto, they'd be a lot more impressive, and I feel that that is something that Proton really should have considered. Admittedly, they did say that they took all of the desires of their customers into consideration. They did a survey, and their customers did say that they would prefer the sort of features available in this car, like GKUI system, the LED headlights and stuff like that, a bit more than active safety. But the thing is, ultimately, as a national car maker, they really ought to be doing their part in raising the safety bar, and unfortunately that's not yet been achieved. But all that said and done, the Proton Iriz is still a relatively decent thing. And now, several years after its launch, now after its gearbox has been properly overhauled and given the treatment that it's supposed to get, the Iriz is finally something that we can recommend as something that you can actually live with. It's no longer as recalcitrant and backward as it used to be. It's not as noisy, it's now more comfortable, more quiet, while still maintaining the Proton drivability that it's famous for. And for that, it is still something to recommend. But that said, it comes with a caveat. If someone were to ask you what B-segment hatchback they should buy, it would be very difficult to make a beeline for the Iriz without first mentioning the far more comprehensively equipped Proto Myvi. In any case, that's been our review of the 2022 PROTON Iriz Active. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe. Jangan bodoh.